Welcome to the Music Ed Matters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Williams-Birch, and this podcast, it exists for you. Whether you're a music lover, an educator, a choir member, each week we bring guests to the show to help explore what matters in music. I'm so glad that you're here. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the Music Ed Matters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Williams-Birch, and I'd like to remind you, thanks to our guest today, to please secure your artistic mask first before helping others create art. I know it sounds like a joke, but y'all, I can't wait for you to meet Kathryn Patricia Cobbler. She is such a dynamic teaching artist, composer, looping violist. Y'all, I need a loop pedal. But in this conversation, we talk about the role of arts in the classroom, but specifically how to go deep with music into the stories of our singers' lives and use musical questioning and musical experiences to grow empathy and community connection. Kathryn has such a heart and a passion for bringing people together with the power of music and the storytelling power of music. She is just an incredible artist, and I think you will feel very inspired through this conversation. Oh, and she has a great tip for those of us, like myself, who struggle with improvisatory practices. Y'all, stay tuned, because it's a great tip. Anyway, this episode is brought to you by our friends at Kaleidoscope Adventures and the Kinnison Choral Company. If you need anything else, jump over to patreon.com/musicedmatters, or you can send me a contact just like Kathryn did at emilybirch.org/contact. That's enough. Let's jump into this conversation with Kathryn Patricia Cobbler. Today on the Music Ed Matters podcast, we are talking to Kathryn Patricia Cobbler. Hello, Kathryn.
Hi, Dr. Emily. How are things?
They are so good. I'm very excited to get to know you on this podcast episode. Listeners, Kathryn was wonderful and sent not just like an email through the contact page of the website, but sent examples and a YouTube clip. I went down such the rabbit hole after that YouTube clip. Kathryn, you do loop violin compositions.
Yeah.
You have whoa, we need to start from the beginning. How did Kathryn Patricia Cobbler get into music? Tell us your story.
Oh, well, thank you so much. So my journey into music started, growing up. I'm the youngest of three, and the rule in my house was that we all needed to play an instrument. So I actually started on the piano, but for my 5-year-old brain, doing one thing with one hand and then doing something else with another wasn't translating very well. And so my dad had asked me, do you want to play the violin? And at the time, I didn't even know what a violin was, but I thought, you know what, let's go for it. And like many things, I think I fell in love with the sound of string instruments. So I started on the violin, and then halfway through my undergrad, I switched to the viola, which I play mainly now. But something that I think, along with loving the sound of the instrument, it was the community, it was the friends that I made along the way, and like other instruments that play in ensembles. It was the group class, it was orchestra, it was string quartets that really just made for a rich experience in learning music and what led to me doing it professionally.
So you are from Canada.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You're from Ottawa. Tell us what music education's like. What is the music world like in Canada?
Yeah, and it's, I think there would be lots of crossover between the two, between America and Canada. I actually grew up in Windsor, Ontario, which is right on the Michigan border there, and just, slowly made my way northeast as I continued in school and degrees and then playing professionally. So part of the work that I do these days is that I do a lot of concerts. I do a lot of interactive concerts in schools and workshops. And so those tend to be multidisciplinary experiences. I'm a big fan of the philosophy of when we look at engaging in the arts, helping students to make art they care about, and really tapping into that intrinsic motivation for learning.
So did you know that you wanted to take music into the schools? Like, I'm all about the string family, I'm going to be a performer, and I'm going to do this in schools. How did all of this come about?
Oh my goodness, that is a very good question. Thank you. So, I knew that I loved the instrument, but I didn't necessarily know what I wanted to do with it. It's kind of funny in terms of that, I loved playing in orchestra, but and in some moments I felt like I'm a chatty Cathy in the literal sense, in that oftentimes when we have an orchestral work, it's such this grand experience. You have all these amazing voices coming together for this and creating this work that is beautiful. But at the end of the concert, there isn't oftentimes where the audience and the musicians connect. The experience ends and then we leave and we don't actually get to dialogue with one another. And so I think for me, I felt like I loved performing, but I wanted to see if I could do it in a way that created a bit more dialogue and basically almost like a co-creation with the people that were in the room. And so it was after my undergrad degree, and I had discovered this thing. Well, in Canada, we tend to call them artist educators. I think on the American side, they call them teaching artists. And so basically these are practicing, artists, but then use their skills as performers and then their skills as educators to explore that liminal space of engagement for students in different ways. And so that's what really, when I started to read books and hear about people doing this work, that's what really propelled me into wanting to be an artist that would go into schools and to help students have these creative experiences.
So it's not just what you're hearing, it's the unpacking of the experience along the way or at the end?
I would say at every moment of the experience. For example, I have one concert that I do. I have the pleasure of being on this artist roster in Ottawa. It's the acronym is MASK, but it stands for Multicultural Arts in Schools and Communities. So they send artists of all disciplines into schools, into seniors' homes, into community settings. And I have a concert that I present through them that's called Unleash, Igniting Creativity Through Art and Sound. And basically the whole concert is a choose your own adventure story building workshop. So with an audience of 300 kids, I will play a soundtrack of music and we build a story together. We start by looking at where the story takes place. Who are the characters? What journey will they go on? What conflicts will they encounter along the way? And then oftentimes we don't end the story, but I'll leave it with the teachers to finish the stories with their classes. And then we end up with these multiple beautiful examples of stories. And so it's bridging the gap between story development, but also listening to music and responding to it and seeing, how does the music craft the story in a literal sense?
Yeah, that makes total, responding to music is one of our national standards of music education. I'm sure Canada has something similar.
We do. For our arts curriculum, it is by province or by state. So the language that's used by state in the curriculum is a little bit different, but at the end of the day, the elements are the same.
Yeah, so that response piece is something that is so important, but I love that you say this in your interview. There was a really great interview that you did on YouTube through that organization that you just mentioned, and you said it's through a lens of storytelling that you hope to inspire students and seniors, whoever's in the audience, to frame their life in a creative way. So how do you do this? How are you getting them to interact with you when there's 300 kids in the room? What are some of the things that listeners can take away from your experience in the big settings and use in their classroom settings?
That's a really good question. Whether I'm doing a concert for 300 to 500 kids, or I'm doing a workshop in a room of 30, I'm always asking a question that starts with the listener's values at heart. So, I have a workshop that, I might do with 30 students, and it's a music-inspired workshop called Sound and Living Color. And then before we start the workshop, I say, we are going to answer this one question. If you could go anywhere in the world, where would you go? So centering it around their curiosity and their discovery. And then bringing it back to this interactive concert, Unleash, Igniting Creativity Through Art and Sound. Before we start the concert experience, I have a mic and I'm going into the audience asking the students, what are your favorite stories? What books do you like to read? What comic books do you like to read? Who are your favorite characters from TV or what have you? And so I really feel like I get to know the students in a broader sense, and starting with, what are the things that they value? And then from there, we start the adventure.
So it starts with knowing the person first, knowing the value of each individual. And then from there, how do you tie it into the music? Is that where your composition creativity comes from?
Yeah. And so even in my own compositional practice, I'm really inspired by storytelling or basing a piece of music on a specific scene or a setting or emotions. And so when the students are in that concert experience, as they're sharing, about the stories that they like, and then when we go to craft the characters, I talk to the students about, this is a piece of music I want to share with you. Here are some of the influences behind that piece of music, some of the things that I was experiencing when I was writing this piece of music. And then I invite the students into a part of active listening. And then for them to share with me, some might say, what, I really saw a really nice sunset there. Or I felt like I was seeing cherry blossom trees. Or some people might say, I saw someone running in the fields. But getting them to engage in active listening as they're listening to the music and to think about what words, what images, or what emotions come to mind.
And it all ties back to their values and their individual stories.
Yes,
I'm so glad to talk about value. I just published a book not very long ago, and the first chapter is about communicating value. I had a friend who helped me write it. It was a fun book. But it's called The Business of Choir, and chapter 1 is communicating value. And it's something that we almost lose as we grow up, that ability to communicate why what we do is valuable in a variety of ways. So we in this circle here can communicate the power of music. We know that what you're playing, how you're phrasing it, with the techniques you're using, the loops, which we have to talk about in a second, all of that paints a picture that the students can then analyze. We know that value, but if we start tossing all those musical words in a conversation with a non-musician, what value does that provide to them? So how do you spin or explain the value of this fantastic concept of storytelling and engagement? And really, you talk about empathy and connection. How do you spin that? How are you communicating that to school districts and schools and other places so they know what value they're getting?
Oh, that's a great question. And I think you really named it when you were talking about the different language, right? Sometimes if we use all these musical terms with people who may not be musicians, we can kind of get lost in the shuffle a little bit because it's not a language of communication that they might not be as familiar with. So in the same vein, when I'm approaching a school or a community center, I try my best to align myself with language that reflects their values. So if it's a school that, if they've got their 3 to 6 teachers and they're really working on, this concept of creating together in community, I'm going to use those education terms from the curriculum guidelines. And in Canada, depending on the province that you're in, it changes. So trying to familiarize myself with those things so that in the same vein, I'm using language that communicates the value that they want for their communities.
That is so well said, and such a good example too. Thanks for sharing that. Let's jump over to looping. How did Miss I play in an orchestra and I love violin and viola, how in the universe did you become a looping artist?
If you would have asked me maybe 5 years ago if I would ever use a loop pedal, the first thing I would have said to you is, what is that? And second, I don't think so. And it was, I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago where I was kind of in a kind of a pivotal part in my career where I had the opportunity to play a lot of great gigs in the city and some really, really enriching musical experiences. But I think I just felt like it was time for kind of a refresh in my artistic practice. I think I wasn't as excited about it. And I had a friend of mine who's an amazing loop pedal artist, both a violinist and a violist. And we had taught together at an Elsa Stemba-inspired music program here in Ottawa. And so it was before a staff meeting, and we were chatting, and she said, what, I have this old loop pedal. It still works really well. I don't know what I want to do with it. I don't know if I should give it away or what have you. And I just thought, what? Hey, I would be interested in trying it out. And I did something that I'm not sure if I would recommend to anyone, that I think it actually served me well. And that I actually booked a gig for myself at using the loop pedal before I even knew how to use it, before I even got it.
You spoke it into existence. You were like, I'm going to get this and learn, and we're going to be great. I'm booking a gig. Okay, go.
Yeah. But you know what that did is it really helped me to narrow in. I had about a month, and it was just, really focusing. I was arranging music. It was for this Canada Day celebration. It was going to be like people were going to be passing by, but it wasn't necessarily a quote unquote concert, if you will. So it was a pretty, low key. But I was arranging all of these Canadian folk tunes. So I was figuring out how do I play and do the footwork for the loop pedal. But it really helped me to get comfortable with the medium. And to this day, I still treat the loop pedal as its own instrument. And so when I look at my loop pedal practice, I think of it as I usually describe myself as a loop pedal violist because it's naming that, I'm using the loop pedal with my solo viola, but really it's the two instruments interacting with each other, if that makes sense.
Well, that makes total sense, and it makes me want to get a loop pedal.
Yeah,
Note to self, loop pedal. But I love that it's two different things. I think there's a deeper thing here, Kathryn. Set a goal, even if it's scary, and make it happen.
Mm-hmm. And I think that it really helps us to, to trust ourselves and to follow our curiosity when we do that. Yeah.
Trust ourselves and follow our curiosity. Do you see the students in your workshops developing and changing and becoming more curious or discovering new things? You mentioned those words earlier. How do you see that developing and changing? What's your measure marker to show that there was a valuable time had by all?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, when I go into a school, I think there is this awareness in knowing that I'm going into a community space that is foreign to me. I don't really know the teachers or the students very well, and I'm a guest in their space. And I'm also recognizing that as I'm coming in as an artist, but then also using educational skills, but I also don't necessarily have the same constraints as a classroom teacher. When you have a classroom teacher and you've got those guidelines that you have to kind of those boxes you need to check by the end of the year, oftentimes that can really narrow in on your focus. So the thing that I try to do as much as I can is really holding a space for the students to ask questions about things that they value. And always wanting to tie it back to the curriculum, but really focusing my time with the students on the creative process so that we're honoring the process over the product. And I find that a way that I can communicate that to the educators, to the administrators at the end is always being able to show my work, so to speak, through the concert. So as we're going on, I'm playing and I've got my loop pedal and the concert set up, but then I also have this big board where we're writing down, we're drawing out the different characters, we're showing the story, and then they get a record of these are all the creative things that the students have showcased. And then it gives the students an opportunity to take that a step forward and to finish the journey. So I think really in terms of communicating that value, it's showing your work and really taking people step by step through the creative process.
I love it. You're holding space for people to be in that creative process without some of the limitations or some of the restrictions of, we call them SLOs, student learning objectives, or other types of benchmarks that are necessary for academics along the way.
Yeah, and the hope is that their work and our time together fuels them in that learning, as they go over those benchmarks. But it is a little bit of a pause of their regular day to day, and that it's an hour where we get to focus just on our creativity and asking those questions and seeing where it takes us.
Fantastic. So you've talked about how your workshops kind of fit in with what students are doing, what classroom teachers are doing, what communities are doing. But when we were filling out the form, getting ready for this episode, you talked about the role of arts in the classroom and how experiencing music as a class, as a school, as a community helps to grow empathy and community connection. Talk more about that.
Yes. A big part of my work is storytelling, and I find that music is a powerful storytelling tool. And I think that when we talk about allowing students to be able to create music, create art that they care about, part of that is allowing them to bring all parts of themselves to the art that they're creating, and what does it look like to invite a student who, say they're studying the clarinet or they're studying the piano, to be able to learn those hard skills, those technical skills, and those artistic skills, but then be able to apply it to music that really holds meaning for them. And I think it's in that case where we start to see that storytelling take place. And as they share that music with their classmates, with their teachers, then that brings them into their a little bit more of their life stories. And that's where that empathy starts to build.
It's like you're using Brene Brown's vulnerability material, but you have music as the undertone. It's the almost like the safety net. I'm going to tell this piece of myself and be vulnerable, but I can do it through the power of music.
Yeah. And I think that, at the end of the day, we all want to be seen and we all want to be known. And without vulnerability, I think it's a hard thing. It's hard to do that. And I think that vulnerability really is core to that process.
So what do you do when you're designing these workshops and these sessions? Are you starting from something inside of you that you want to communicate, or where are you starting from when you talk about wanting to inspire people to explore music in their story? What's your starting point for developing stuff?
That's a great question. A question of my own that I like to ask when I'm performing on stage is, what do we need right now? And so it allows me to stay present to myself. It allows me to stay present to the audience. And I love asking that question because no matter if I'm playing, a piece of music that I've written, a piece of music that another composer has written, or if I'm engaging in live improvisation, which I often do, that musical experience is one that will never be, replicated the same again because of who's in the room, the time of day, it'll never be the same. And I think that if we can really tap into that, that's when we start to have, that's where the magic happens. And so when I'm designing a program, I like to ask that question of, what do we need? And sometimes it might start from an idea of my own, a part of my own curiosity. But as I'm developing either a concert or a workshop, I start to try and put myself into the shoes of a classroom teacher and try to stretch my own empathy skills and think, if I was a teacher in a classroom and I wanted my students to engage deeper in their creativity through multidisciplinary arts mediums, what could that look like? And then that really helps to fuel the creation of workshops and the concerts that I present.
It's also such a great question to ask, just in general. What does the community need? What do my students need? Asking that first is such a great example. Thank you for setting that for us. So, improvisatory practices for people that are very somewhat boxy in their musical expression and experience, what are some tips that you have to get out of the box?
Ooh, I really like this question. And, I hold a lot of empathy for that because that's definitely where I came from in terms of, I grew up in learning in the Western classical tradition and definitely identify with that feeling of tentativeness in approaching improvisation, and an activity that I encourage my students to do that I still do in my own, practice life is keeping a sound journal. And what that is that before, when you start your practice, you allow yourself to just see what comes out, to play whatever notes or sounds that come out of your instrument. And what I like to do, and I think this is perhaps the vulnerable part for many people, is that I record these sessions. I record these, so it's literally a short clip, and so I press record, whether that's on my phone or I'm using my digital recorder. So I'm just recording the sounds that come out. And I often tell people that when they start this sound journal experience, it's oftentimes, when you go to the cottage for the first time of the season, and then you run the water and it comes out and it's like a little green and it's a little funny and you might not want to drink it at first because it's the first time of the season, but then you let the water run and it becomes clear. And that I find is often a way that improvisation, comes about, and that when you're first starting in your practice, there might be sounds or that come out that you might not like. And that's
a little green and dirty.
Yeah. And keeping a sound journal and oftentimes that question of what do we need right now, the sound journal is a way of intuitively asking that of yourself, and I think that's something that perhaps something as classically trained musicians, when we focus more on the product and the process, I think we forget the human nature of playing sometimes. And that, what if I have a deadline for something, I might be thinking I must learn this because I have a deadline. But knowing that we're people, and sometimes, before you go into your practice session, you might be tired. You might, be a little bit frustrated, or you might be stressed about something, and just acknowledging that's how you're coming into the space. And I think the sound journal is a really great way of kind of intuitively asking that of yourself, letting that sound and emotion to come out before you go on to other elements of your practice.
A sound journal. I love it. And it loops back to the main question, asking yourself, what do you need right now? What do we all need right now? And how can music help us find it? That is incredible. So you've talked about the role of all of these workshops and using music and bringing community together, telling stories. Are there any other pieces of the role of arts in the classroom that you want to share with the listeners?
I feel like the role of arts in the classroom, it can be used to grow empathy. It can be used as a story building, a community building tool. But I think it plays a big part in developing citizen artistry. What does it look like to have students that are more citizen minded, to think about their surroundings and what can we do to help make that community better? I studied with a violist in Canada for my master's, and he used to say, whenever you put the viola up to play, you have to figure out how to make the world a better place. And when we think about, if we give that call to each of our students, whatever their artistic medium is, whenever you play, whenever you draw, whenever you paint, you need to figure out how to make the world a better place. How that reframes our artistic practice, I think, has amazing results. And so I think that's another thing that I would encourage teachers to explore. How can we use the music for storytelling? How can we use it to grow empathy? And then to go even further to say, how can we enrich our community and our spaces?
And to change the world. Wow. It's been so fun just hearing your heart and your passion for putting music out there to let people dive and explore their individual stories that bring them together. It's so exciting. And tell the listeners a little bit about where they can find out more about your concerts and your workshops and everything.
Yeah. So if you like to hang out online, if you're on Instagram, I'm at Kathryn Patricia Violist. On Facebook, I'm KP Violist. And if you just wanted to, check out my work, my website is kathrynpatricia.com. I mentioned earlier that I have the privilege of being on an artist roster here in Canada, and I do both in person, but a lot of online concerts and things that are live and things that are video on demand that are interactive as well. And that's through an organization with an acronym MASK, but it stands for Multicultural Arts in Schools and Communities. And if you wanted to head over there, you can also see, some of my concert and workshop offerings there as well.
Very awesome. I'm so glad that you took the time to send a little contact to me through my website. That is just so cool.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. And, I've enjoyed just listening to your podcast, and I love just the way that it's really conversational and you really draw out, just gems from people. So this has been really great for me to dialogue with you and to be part of this larger conversation for your podcast. So thank you so much for having me.
Well, you are so welcome. You brought some great gems. I always give the guest one final opportunity before they go for the one thing that really matters that you want the listener to walk away with. So what is that thing for you today?
I think the one thing, particularly if there are educators who are listening, is to remember to put on your creative mask first. I think oftentimes when we are educating, we pour ourselves out for our students, and I think that as much as we want to be able to do that, we want to remember that we are musicians and artists first. And I think that even if we take 5 minutes, even if you just, play one bar that is you creating, that joy of learning will translate to your students. So I think that would be the thing, is just to remember that you are an artist, you are a musician, and to remember to take time to put on your creative mask first.
That's perfect. Your creative mask first. Maybe I'll title the episode that. That's pretty intuitive and wonderful. This has been lovely, Kathryn. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Have you secured your artistic mask first? I love how this conversation started with value at the center and looking at multifaceted ways to bring music and exploration of stories and individual stories to our singers and our communities. As you heard her say, music is powerful. It's a very powerful storytelling device. And that one question to ask, what do we need right now? What a great start. Y'all, secure that mask. Go be the wonderful musicians and creators that we know you are. And in case no one has told you today, you, my friend, you matter. We all know that music matters, especially music that brings us together as a community and allows us to explore our stories and to be empathetic with each other. And I'll see you next time on the Music